I'm David with Spike It. We're using CoLure Coat 2.0 with brush techniques today, and we're going to be working on a baby bass design. First thing we want to do is take our lure, place it on our holder. The holder is a very simple design. It's a flat piece of wood, wide enough so it's not going to knock over easily when you're working with it, and 3 finishing nails pop through it. You want to make sure that you got your lure on there relatively straight, because that's going to be how your bait paints. So this lure here, if you put it on straight, if you put it on crooked and you go to put a line down it, the line will appear straight on here, but then when you take your lure off, you'll end up having a wave in it. So to avoid that, we try to put the lure on as straight as possible. We stretch it out, keep it kind of taut, but stretch it this way when you put it down so you get a decent layout. Now, first thing we're going to be using is going to be a black, but instead of using just pure black, we're going to take the black and put a few drops, because black is relatively strong compared to your other colors. And we're going to use a little bit of the clear. About half and half is about the best spot you need for that. And I'm going to do a little cheat here and just use the handle of my paintbrush to mix this together. The reason I'm doing that instead of using the brush itself is because even though I've done painting for way too long, you still have a tendency to dig your paintbrush into that when you're mixing it, and you end up getting paint up into your brush. You want to avoid getting paint up into the metal part of the brush, the ferrule, because that will end up causing it to misshape your brush when it dries. When you go to wash your brush out, you're not going to really be able to get up inside of it to wash the ferrule out. So you just avoid that when you use your paints. I'm going to do a little bit of knocking some of the black off, and then I'm going to add the black down the side of the brush, down the side of the lure. We're also going to use baby bass green on this one, so I'm going to go ahead and put a little bit of baby bass green out. And I'm going to put it over here just because it's pretty dark, and I don't want to accidentally glance down and mix up the baby bass green with my reduced black. And I'm cleaning the top off because I'm just a little control nut when it comes to that kind of stuff, because I know you can forget about it and pick it up pretty easily. Now, before I use this green, I'm going to get a little bit of this black that I've used the clear in to kind of reduce it a little bit, reduce the power of it. I'm going to move that around a little bit on the side. And the baby bass has kind of a pattern down the side of it, but the pattern really doesn't have what we would really think of as very systematic pattern. So what I'm doing now is I'm just putting some brushed on area spots down it. And this is all reaction. You put it down, you look what it looks like, and then you move the edges around, fade them out a little bit, put some more beside it to look a little different, and just move them down the lure itself. You might want to take it further down than I'm taking it towards the tail. You might want to stop it further up before the tail. Each one of these lures can have a natural different look to them just by you changing how you put the patterns on the side. What I would tell you to do is I would avoid a lot of really hard edges on this pattern, because we want it to have more of a faded feel to it. And we're going to put a dark green over the top of it that'll make it even less obvious of a pattern. The next thing we're going to do is come along the top with the clear and black mixture. Make sure you go all the way to the half mark on the top, just because when you flip it to the other side, to do the other side, you don't want to have a stripe of the lure color down the middle necessarily, unless you think that might be something that would be a benefit for how you think it should look. Again, these all end up being about how you want to design them. I'm just giving you some clues on some basic patterns. And now you'll notice I'm just kind of fading the black down the top and then pulling it a little bit looser. I'm not pulling it all the way down into the pattern that I made, but I'm making it get pretty close. And I'm just going to get a touch of the real black, the solid black, just to give me a little bit more of a darker value along the ridge on the top. Now what I'll do is that I'll let this dry, or I'll hit it with a hair dryer to speed up the brushing process before I put the green on. If we go into it right now with the green, the moisture of the green paint will kind of reactivate the moisture in the black, and it'll just kind of smudge it, and we'll lose our pattern. So we want to let that dry, or accelerate the drying before we move on. Now you'll notice now I've gone to a flat brush because I'm wanting to put basically what we refer to as a covering wash down the side of the fish itself. What I did on the top, or even the side, you can do with the flat brush, but it's a little trickier to do the designs down the side with the flat brush. You can take the brush and just put your design on there and kind of turn it down the side. The thing that you want to watch with that, though, is making them all look the same length and the same movement. Then they'll get a little too redundant. So you want to play around with how you shape them if you use the flat brush. I find it easier to use the round to keep my randomness in the pattern when I'm making my marks. The round brush, though, would work great for what I did on the top. It actually would be easier to use than the flat brush would work great for what I did on the top. It'll be easier to use than the round brush to create that fade and move it down the side. So you'll also find that you're going to have a affection for, or just enjoy using one type of brush probably a little more than the other one. So the one that you're comfortable with is going to be the one you're probably going to want to use the most. Now I'm putting the baby bass green on it, and you'll see if you look closely right here that there's an easy fade down the side that still shows us the pattern. Now I'm just giving myself a basic movement and fade. I have a lot greener at the top and it gets lighter as I come down. I'm going to use the baby grass green here again along the top to get it darker. Don't forget about the head of the fish. You want to try to do that while you're doing the rest of the fish, just to keep it consistent. If you go back and try to paint it separately, it's probably going to look like it was painted separately, like there'll be edges along it that give us a very different value than some of the other spots. You also want to make sure that if you brush over the eye, that you kind of clean the excess paint out of the eye, just to avoid it from puddling in there, because it could inhibit your Fix-A-Lure or your CoLure from connecting quickly and fastening quickly. You know, if it's dry, it won't be a problem, but if it's not completely dry, if you get a little bit of extra paint in there, the big problem is when you go to put the eye in it, it'll smush the paint outside and you'll end up with a weird splotch on your lure. And again, you'll see that it's, the more I spread it out, the lighter the value gets in the paint. And I'm wanting it dark along the top. So I'm still going back and spreading and fading and spreading and fading, but I'm going back and putting more of that paint along the top to get it darker. And there are all kind of other little tricks you can do. You can mix a little black into a different area of paint for your green, so you'll get a darker green. Maybe you want to use the flow green along the bottom of this to get a really lighter, different value of green into your image. All kind of little tricks you can just experiment with yourself. This one right here I'm doing is a basic. And you'll notice you can just play with these things forever, but you got to make a judgment call on when you're going to stop, because you can end up doing a lot more damage to them if you just keep putting paint on them to what you're trying to get the effect, than if you just get to a certain point and just quit on it. We also want to put our eye on this one, so to do that I'm going to use the CoLure Coat Clear. I'm going to use a couple of drops of it. You can also, and a couple of drops is probably excessive. All you need is a very small amount for this actual activity. Fix the Lure is also a product that you can use that is specifically for repairing and fixing lures. It's a great adhesive. It will do a fine job of this as well. You'll notice what I'm doing here is I'm just using the end of my paintbrush. I'm going to put just a little dot in there. You don't want to use too much of that. You also want to remember to clean your paintbrush off, or it will end up gluing itself to something that you weren't planning on. Now, this part's actually a little tricky. You just have to get it in there and drop it on. The thing you have to remember is if your paint is still wet, you're going to probably mess your paint up. So you want to dry your paint, or wait for your paint to dry before you probably attempt to put the eye on it. And then you want to make sure you don't have too much of the adhesive, because when you go to place the eye in, the eye will have a tendency to stick to your finger anyway, so you got to be careful with making sure it's not going to just come back out or get moved around. But you also will end up squeezing too much of the adhesive out the side, and you'll end up with a blob on the side. So just make sure you're only using a little bit and spread it around in there good, so it's not going to end up causing you a problem. You also notice that I have my paintbrushes in water in between uses. That keeps them from drawing water up into the paintbrush handle, which will end up, if you decide to store them in water, it'll end up ruining your paintbrush. So you want to avoid that. When you go to use them, you want to make sure that you get all that water back out of it before you put it in the paint, unless you're planning on thinning the paint a little bit with water. But remember, if you dip in with the paintbrush into your paint, you're actually going to contaminate the strength of that paint with the water. Our last step is going to be dipping our lure in the Clearasil, which has already been heated. If you want to get a review or have questions about heating, there's a video that we already have called Heating Plastisol that you can watch. It will give you the steps to heating it properly. What we want to do is insert a hook into the end. Make sure that you're careful of the hook itself, and we basically just go in and dip. Remember, this is very hot melted plastic, so you don't want to get it on your hands or fingers. Take it in right at the edge of the tail, pull it back out, let it drain the excess off. While it's draining, once it gets down to a pretty thin drain, you can just take it over to the side and kind of dip the end of it off, and then take it over to your hanger and hang it, and just wait for it to finish drying, and then you're pretty much set. This is our finished product. We waited for it to dry. Clear coat gives it a nice luster and a three-dimensional kind of drop back into the surface to make the colors even more luminous. And you just get this guy here, rig it up, and you're ready to fish.